Hello. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here with you all today. I'm delighted to be here. As you know, I'm coming from Arizona, so I apologize. I'm going to sit down because I'm quite jet-lagged. Feeling a little tired. Okay. So today I'm going to talk to you about cognitive deficits among long-term cannabis users. We know from case control studies that heavy cannabis users show cognitive deficits relative to non-users. Case control studies are studies that compare heavy users with non-users on cognitive functioning at a single point in time. Limitations of these studies, because they compare cannabis users and non-users on cognitive functioning at a single point in time, these studies cannot rule out the possibility that cognitive deficits are apparent prior to the initiation of cannabis use. These case control studies also rely on retrospective reports of cannabis use, which can be inaccurate due to forgetting. So what we need are data from prospective longitudinal studies. These are studies that follow people prospectively over time and assess both cannabis use and cognitive functioning repeatedly. The strengths of these studies are that they compare each person to him or herself from before to after cannabis initiation. What I'm going to do in today's talk is present findings on the association between long-term cannabis use and cognitive functioning from a prospective longitudinal study. And I'm going to present two studies of the same cohort followed to midlife. The first study was published back in 2012, and it followed the cohort to when they were 38 years old. The second study is brand new and follows the cohort now an additional 7 years. They're currently 45 years old. What you'll learn in today's talk is that long-term cannabis users show IQ decline from childhood to midlife, and they show midlife cognitive deficits across multiple domains. This seems to be driven by adolescent onset users who continue to use over many years. It also seems to be the case that these cognitive deficits are likely a consequence of long-term cannabis use because we rule out a number of alternative explanations. Further, I'll tell you that midlife cognitive deficits among long-term cannabis users are larger than deficits among long-term alcohol and tobacco users. So this is contrary to some claims by proponents of legalization. Okay, study one. The data from this study come from the Dunedin Longitudinal Study, which is a prospective study of a birth cohort, a representative birth cohort of individuals born in Dunedin, New Zealand in 1972 and 73, and followed from birth up through age 38 with 95% retention. So what you're seeing here in this table are the ages of the assessments, right? Study members were assessed at age 3, 5, 7, 9, and so on. And you'll see the number of participants at each wave, as well as the retention at each wave of assessment. Importantly, the study has before and after IQ testing. So IQ was tested in childhood when study members were between 7 and 13 years old. Then we assessed cannabis use and cannabis dependence from ages 18 to 38. And then IQ was assessed again in adulthood at age 38 after some members of the cohort had been using cannabis for many years. IQ is a measure of general cognitive ability. It can be broken down into verbal and performance abilities, which then can be further broken down into the more specific cognitive abilities. What's important to know is that IQ tests are some of the most reliable and valid psychological assessments that we have. An IQ score of 100 is average. Okay, so what I'm showing you here is a frequency distribution of IQ in the general population, and 100 is the average score, with looks like 68% of people falling between a score of 85 and 115. So we assessed cannabis use and dependence at ages 18, 21, 26, 32, and 38. And cannabis dependence means compulsive cannabis use despite experiencing social, legal, or health problems. We took this information about cannabis dependence at each of these prospective assessment waves, and we created groups of people based on how persistently they diagnosed with cannabis dependence over time. So we had a group of people who never used cannabis at any of the study waves, and therefore they never diagnosed with cannabis dependence. We had a group of people who used cannabis, but only recreationally. They never diagnosed with cannabis dependence. They never showed the compulsive use. A group of people who diagnosed with cannabis dependence one time between ages 18 and 38, 2 times, and 3 or more times. And this we used as our exposure. So we asked, do these persistent cannabis users show IQ decline? And what you see here are those same groups, right? Grouped based on how persistently they diagnose with cannabis dependence over time. And I'm showing you their IQ in childhood, before cannabis use initiation. Okay, so here's their childhood IQ. And what you'll notice, if you remember, an IQ of 100 is average. So what you'll notice is that even the people who went on to become persistent cannabis users had average childhood IQ. This is their IQ in adulthood at age 38. And here we have the change in IQ from childhood to adulthood. With the group who never used cannabis, these are study members who never used cannabis, showing a slight 1 point, approximately, increase in IQ from childhood to adulthood. But as you move down into the more persistently cannabis dependence groups, you see more and more IQ decline. This is a dose-response association. The more persistently a person was using cannabis over their life, the more IQ decline we observed. Next, we asked, are there alternative explanations? Can the dose-response association be explained by recent cannabis use, recent tobacco dependence, recent hard drug dependence, persistent alcohol dependence, or even schizophrenia? As you've heard today, cannabis use is a risk factor for schizophrenia. People with schizophrenia also tend to show IQ deficits, so this is why we wanted to rule out that this might be due to schizophrenia. So what I'm going to show you here in this figure is change in IQ from childhood to adulthood, okay? With 0 indicating no change, positive scores indicating an increase in IQ from childhood to adulthood, and negative scores indicating a decline. And I'm going to plot that as a function of those persistence of cannabis dependence groups. So this is what I just showed you, in the previous slide. Formatting problem, I think. This is what I just showed you in the previous slide, and it shows that, again, people who never used cannabis showed a slight increase in IQ, but as you move up into the more persistently cannabis dependence groups, we see more and more IQ decline. Next, we wanted to know if this could be explained by recent cannabis use right before the adult IQ testing, right? So what we did is we excluded anyone who said they had used cannabis in the past 24 hours before the age 38 IQ testing, and we recomputed the effect sizes, and here are those effect sizes. What you see is we still, even after removing these people who had used cannabis recently, we still see this dose-response association, suggesting that past 24-hour cannabis use cannot explain why we were seeing IQ decline among the long-term cannabis users. We did the same thing for people who'd used cannabis in the past week. We also excluded people who had persistent tobacco dependence, persistent hard drug dependence, persistent alcohol dependence, and schizophrenia. And what you can see is regardless of which group we dropped, we still see these dose-response associations, suggesting none of these factors can explain why the long-term cannabis users are showing IQ decline, making it more likely that this is an effect due to the cannabis. Associations could also not be explained by low socioeconomic status or reduced years of education. Next, we asked if adolescent onset cannabis users were more vulnerable. This question stems from a hypothesis that you heard Dr. Madras talk about, that because adolescents' brains are still developing, they may be more susceptible to the effects of cannabis on cognitive functioning. Okay, so what I'm going to do is show you change in IQ from childhood to adulthood, again with 0 indicating no change, positive score is an increase in IQ, negative score is a decline. I'm going to plot that for adolescent onset cannabis users. These are people in the cohort who began using cannabis before age 18. And then I'll plot that for the adult onset cannabis users, people who began using after age 18. And here are the IQ change scores for the adolescent onset cannabis users, and what you see is a dose-response association, right? The people who used in adolescence, diagnosed just one time in adolescence, showed some small IQ decline, but as we went into found adolescents who used for longer and longer, we see more and more IQ decline. And here are the data for the adult onset users. What you see is that the adult onset cannabis users, people who began using in adulthood but used persistently, did not show this dose-response association. They had a small IQ decline, but it was not clearly equal to what we saw in the adolescent users, suggesting that adolescents are more vulnerable to potential cannabis effects on cognitive functioning. And for the most persistently using adolescent onset users, we saw an 8-point IQ decline. And there's the ends. So to summarize, do persistent cannabis users show IQ decline? Yes, particularly adolescent onset persistent cannabis users. Can this effect be explained by recent cannabis use, alcohol and other drug use, reduced years of education, or even low socioeconomic status among persistent cannabis users? No. Why are these findings important? Well, this is one of the first studies to rule out that lower IQ predates cannabis use. So regardless of their childhood IQ or their pre-cannabis IQ, adolescent onset persistent cannabis users had lower IQ than non-users and than adult onset users in adulthood. How do findings compare to other studies? A number of studies have come out since the publication of our 2012 paper, suggesting very limited evidence of cannabis-related cognitive deficits in adolescents. It's important to remember, however, that these studies are of adolescents with a far less serious level of cannabis exposure. These are studies that talk about cognitive deficits in adolescents who've used cannabis 50 times, right? Or they follow adolescents just ages 18 to 21. What we're talking about in our study is compulsive cannabis use for many years. Here are some of those studies, and you'll notice that one was by our group. Importantly, this is the data on those adolescent onset versus adult onset cannabis users in the Dunedin study, and what you'll notice is our findings are actually not inconsistent with the studies that have been published recently. If you look here just in adolescents, right, the adolescents who diagnosed one time, they showed a 3-point IQ decline, which, as you'll see in the next presentation, is very consistent with results of a recent meta-analysis. Why is an 8-point IQ decline significant? Well, an 8-point IQ loss will drop a person from the average, an average IQ of 100, which is the 50th percentile in intelligence, down to the 29th percentile of intelligence. So an 8-point IQ loss is not trivial. IQ also predicts things like access to university education, lifelong total income, access to a good job, and performance on the job. And in the Dunedin study, persistent cannabis users had less skilled jobs than their own parents. How many people does this affect? Well, we saw that only about 2% of the representative cohort were those adolescent onset persistent cannabis users. But we're concerned because fewer adolescents today think cannabis is harmful, and access to cannabis use is increasing. With legalization, whether we want to think so or not, adolescents are going to use more. And we know from the previous presentation that people who begin using in adolescence are more likely to become dependent and more likely to become those long-term users. Okay, I'm going to move on to the second study. These are new findings from the Dunedin study, now assessed up to age 45 years, again, with very high retention, 94%. The rationale for this study is the cohort's now in midlife and will be followed, hopefully, through older adulthood. And midlife and older adults are using cannabis at historically high rates. These are data from the NISDA study in the US, And they show that year after year, the prevalence of cannabis use among adults ages 65 and over is increasing. There are very few studies, however, that look at cognitive deficits or brain health in midlife or older adult cannabis users. Most of the research is concentrated in adolescents and young adults. And midlife cognitive deficits in cannabis users should be a concern of ours because mild midlife cognitive deficits have been shown in a number of studies to predict risk for dementia. So both mild cognitive deficits as well as smaller hippocampal volume. So in this study, we aimed to characterize the magnitude of cognitive deficits and brain volume differences of long-term cannabis users in midlife. I just want to note that we did do whole brain analyses, but for today, I'm going to really focus on the hippocampus for a few reasons. One, the hippocampus, it has a high concentration of cannabinoid receptors, and two, it has emerged in meta-analyses as the brain region that most consistently emerges as smaller volume in long-term cannabis users. Would you help me advance to this slide? Stuck. Thank you. Okay, this is going to work. I think. How do I go backwards? Okay. So what we did in this study is we identified a group of long-term cannabis users. As you'll see, there was 86 of them in the cohort. They used very long-term. And I think we then identified kind of 5 informative subgroups, comparison groups in the cohort. So the first group that we identified were lifelong cannabis non-users. There were 202 of them in the cohort. We selected this group to replicate the control group used in most case control studies. Next, we selected a group who were midlife recreational cannabis users. We selected this group because we think it's important to try to distinguish non-problem versus problem use, and we wanted to see if non-problem cannabis users showed cognitive deficits and brain volume differences. Next, we selected long-term tobacco users and long-term alcohol users. We selected these groups to serve as benchmark comparisons for any cannabis effects and to help disentangle the effects of alcohol and tobacco from the effects of cannabis. And finally, we had a group of people who had quit using cannabis. There are 60 of them in the cohort. We selected this group to find out if cognitive deficits and hippocampal volume differences are still apparent after cessation. So let me tell you just a little bit, a few details about how we define these groups. The long-term cannabis users, they were assessed at all ages, right, throughout the study. But they, to qualify as a long-term cannabis user, had to use cannabis weekly or more frequently at age 45. They also used weekly at 1 or more previous assessment waves. To kind of give you a sense of how long-term these cannabis users were, I can tell you that on average, this group used 4 or more days per week, so most days in a week, for at least 3 of these 6 total assessment waves between ages 18 and 45. So they're very heavy long-term cannabis users. The long-term alcohol and tobacco users were similarly defined, where they had to use frequently at age 45 and at 1 or more previous assessment waves. They could not have used cannabis at age 45 and had no history of weekly cannabis use or cannabis dependence. So these are pretty much pure alcohol and tobacco users who did not use cannabis. Our midlife recreational users were people who used cannabis relatively infrequently, so less than once a week, in midlife, which was at age 45, 38, or 32. And our cannabis quitters did not use cannabis at age 45, but used cannabis 4 days a week or more, or were cannabis dependent at a previous assessment wave. So they had quit by age 45, which is the age of the adult neuropsychological testing. And our lifelong cannabis non-users, there were 202 of them, they never used cannabis at any of the assessment waves. So the first question we asked was, do long-term cannabis users show larger IQ decline than the 5 informative comparison groups? So these are data showing childhood IQ and age 45 IQ. And first, I'd like to highlight the results for the long-term cannabis users. What you'll see is they had average IQ in childhood, right? Average IQ is a score of 100. Well, they were right there at 99.3. They had below average IQ in adulthood with a score of 93.8. And you'll see that they, on average, as a group, lost 5.5 IQ points from childhood to adulthood. Now let's compare that to what we see in our 5 informative comparison groups. Here we have the cannabis non-users who showed a very slight, less than 1 point increase in IQ from childhood to adulthood. Our long-term tobacco users, they had about a 1.5 point IQ decline. Long-term alcohol users had half a point IQ decline. The midlife recreational users had a negative 3.5 point IQ decline. And the cannabis quitters had a 3.3 point IQ decline. So the long-term cannabis users showed larger and statistically significantly larger IQ decline than any of these comparison groups. Next, do long-term cannabis users show cognitive deficits in other domains? Whoa, that's tiny. Sorry. What I'm going to show you is findings about age 45 neuropsychological functioning across multiple domains. These are domains like learning, memory, working memory, executive function, verbal fluency. Then we report on the working memory index, which is a composite index of working memory tests from our IQ tests. Verbal comprehension index, processing speed index, and motor functioning. And I'm going to show you scores on all of those tests for our long-term cannabis users and each of the comparison groups. What I want to point out in this figure is that line there in the middle of the figure is the reference line. It's the cohort, the representative cohort norm. Okay, so on 1,000 people from this birth cohort, 0, we normed it at 0. So you're going to see higher scores mean better than average cognitive test performance, lower scores, worse than average. Here are the results for the long-term cannabis users. What you'll see is their scores are worse than average across different tests compared with the cohort norm. Now let's compare them to our 5 comparison groups. Here are the results for the lifelong cannabis non-users. I'm gonna have to look. Our long-term tobacco users, long-term alcohol users, midlife recreational users, and cannabis quitters. If you take this chart in totality, really what I want you to notice is that the distribution of scores for the long-term cannabis users are shifted to the left relative to everyone else, okay? Showing that across domains, the long-term cannabis users were doing worse. You also, I should point out, sorry, we also did not see cognitive deficits for long-term tobacco users and long-term alcohol users. Next, we asked if friends and relatives noticed cognitive problems. We asked each study member to nominate some friends and relatives who could report on their memory and attention. An example of memory problems is this person forgets to do errands, return calls, and pay bills. An example of an attention problem is this person is easily distracted or gets sidetracked easily. So what I'm going to show you are those mean or average informant reports for each group, okay? With 0 being the cohort norm. Higher scores showing problems, more problems, so it's different than the previous slides in terms of direction, and lower scores indicating fewer problems. Here are the memory and attention problems for the long-term cannabis users, the cannabis non-users, long-term tobacco users, long-term alcohol users, midlife recreational cannabis users, and our cannabis quitters. So what you should notice here is that informants are reporting that the cannabis users, the long-term cannabis users, are really standing out in terms of attention and memory problems. The other group, I guess, that really might stand out here are the cannabis quitters. And to some extent, the long-term tobacco users, those informants also noticed some mild memory and attention problems. We wanted to test dose-response associations because, as Dr. Madras mentioned, that's critical for demonstrating causality. Without a dose-response association, you really can't make causal claims. So what I'm going to do is show you data on answering this question. Do people who use cannabis more persistently show greater IQ decline than people who use cannabis less persistently? So I'm going to take this information on our cannabis dependence assessments from ages 18 to 45. I'm going to group people, just like I did in the previous study. People who never used cannabis, people who used but never diagnosed, people who diagnosed with cannabis dependence 1 time between ages 18 and 45, 2 times, 3 times, and now 4 or more times. And here are those results. What you see is a clear dose-response association. People who never used showed a slight increase in IQ, but as you move up into the more persistently cannabis-dependent groups, you see more and more IQ decline. In terms of alternative explanations, we addressed whether these associations could be explained by persistent tobacco dependence, persistent alcohol dependence, other illicit drug dependence, childhood socioeconomic status, low childhood self-control, and family history of substance use problems. We selected these because these have been shown in the literature to be some of the kind of most obvious covariates or kind of confounders. And so we included all of these as covariates. These are the original results. This is what happens when we adjust for all those problems. What you notice is you still see that dose-response association. There is still, even after taking into account all those other covariates, childhood socioeconomic status, persistent illicit drug dependence, persistent alcohol dependence, even after taking all of those things into account, we still see a dose-response association between persistence of cannabis dependence and IQ decline. Associations could also not be explained by recent cannabis use. Next, we asked if adolescent onset cannabis users are more vulnerable. So I'm going to show you change in IQ, right, for those adolescent onset cannabis users and the adult onset cannabis users. The adolescent onset cannabis users began using before age 18. The adult onset users used after age 18. And here are those data showing for the adolescent onset users, the more persistently they used, the greater the IQ decline. And here's what we see for the adult onset users, no dose-response association. Importantly, this is now, for those most persistent adolescent users, a 13-point IQ decline from childhood to adulthood, whereas it was 8 at our previous wave at age 38. Next, we asked, do long-term cannabis users show smaller hippocampal volume? I'm going to show you results for bilateral hippocampal volume as well as 12 functionally and structurally distinct subregions. Okay. Here are the results for our long-term cannabis users. What you'll want to know here is that 0 is the cohort norm in terms of brain volume for the hippocampus. And so the long-term cannabis users, consistent with case control studies, with meta-analyses, are showing smaller than average hippocampal volume across bilateral volume and all of the 12 subregions. Here are the results for our cannabis non-users, okay? And this comparison is statistically significant. The long-term cannabis users showed smaller hippocampal volume than the cannabis non-users, just like those meta-analyses. Here are the results for our long-term tobacco users, long-term alcohol users, our midlife recreational users, and cannabis quitters. Again, what you really need to notice here is that if you look kind of across all groups, the cannabis users, long-term cannabis users, aren't really standing out, okay? What we know is that the long-term tobacco users, and to some extent the long-term alcohol users, were also showing smaller hippocampal volume, suggesting that it's not just the cannabis users, right? This may not be a causal effect of cannabis. There might be something common to all these different substances that explains the lower hippocampal volume. Next, we asked if smaller hippocampal volume among long-term cannabis users underlie cognitive deficits. There is a hypothesis, it's pretty ubiquitous in the literature, that cannabis use causes smaller hippocampal volume, which then causes cognitive deficits. So I just showed you that long-term cannabis users do have smaller than average hippocampal volume. What I haven't told you is that in the general population, smaller hippocampal volume is related to cognitive deficits. It's true in other studies, as well as here in Dunedin, we checked. People with smaller hippocampal volume have cognitive deficits. I wanted to test this theory, this pathway. Is the reason we're seeing the IQ deficits in the long-term cannabis users due to smaller hippocampal volume? And the answer was no. Sorry to be brief, but no, it was not. So 6 key take-home points. 1, long-term cannabis users showed IQ decline, poor learning, poor processing speed in midlife relative to their childhood IQ. People who knew them well described them as having memory and attention problems, and these associations could not be explained by other factors, a host of factors rigorously assessed across multiple waves by multiple methods, informants, as well as observation and self-report. 2, long-term cannabis users showed significantly larger IQ decline, poorer learning and memory, and poorer processing speed than long-term tobacco or alcohol users. Midlife recreational cannabis users did not show cognitive deficits and should not be conflated with long-term cannabis users in future research. I think this is one of the main issues we're seeing in cannabis research is a problem with characterizing our users, and we're kind of lumping people together that shouldn't be lumped together. So let's take out those recreational users and use them as a separate group. And then cannabis quitters also showed subtle cognitive deficits. In the literature, there are very inconsistent findings on whether even after cessation we see deficits. We saw clearly that the midlife cannabis quitters were performing slightly below than the cohort norm, but it was mild, okay? So these, even after cessation, there are mild cognitive deficits. Long-term cannabis users showed smaller hippocampal volume, consistent with case control studies, but hippocampal volume could not explain cannabis-related cognitive deficits. One thought is that lower hippocampal volume is perhaps too reductionistic of an explanation for the deficits we're seeing, and there's probably other mechanisms we need to investigate as possibly explaining the IQ decline, right? We can talk about structural brain changes in other brain regions, not just the hippocampus, but other brain regions that control things like motivation. We can think about functional brain differences, not just kind of talking about volume, but how the brain functions. And there might be also social mechanisms that are explaining the IQ decline. Midlife cognitive deficits among long-term cannabis users may be consequential. Okay? The effect sizes that we observed here for the midlife long-term cannabis users were comparable to the midlife mild cognitive deficits we have seen in people who go on to develop dementia. The effect sizes were the same. So our next question is, will long-term cannabis users show elevated rates of dementia in later life? This is very important given the huge burden of dementia, and it's timely given the confluence of these two trends, the growth of the aging population and the record high rates of cannabis use among today's older adults. So what should we do? I think it's very important to prevent adolescent use. We need to encourage cessation. We also probably need to increase awareness among midlife and older adults about the risks of cannabis. It's not just about adolescents. Disclosures, and thank you to the Dunedin study team and my collaborators. Thank you.
Thank thank you very much for your presentation on your studies. It was very interesting to listen to, and very significant results as well regarding the effects actually of cannabis on the cognitive function. And yeah, you have shown actually that an 8-point IQ reduction is very significant of those having started before 18, but also in later life, that it's still very much apparent. And it does not sound as much, but it still has very much of an impact due to social developments and education and work, etc. So the results basically cannot really be ignored, I would say. So thank you very much. We do have a question from our online audience, also called Madeline, named Madeline.
Oh, that's great.
Yes, she is asking, does abstaining have any repairing effects, or is the decline irreversible?
That's a great question, and unfortunately, that's kind of inconsistent in the broader literature. What we see is some studies that have measured cognitive functioning repeatedly from before to after quitting. Some of them show recoveries in some functions, like attention, but not others, right, like memory. And that's a really strong design, right, because you're getting repeated measures of cognitive functioning from before to after, for example, a quit attempt. However, there's other studies that show the opposite. And in our studies, we're seeing mild deficits in people who quit, but we're really needing to look kind of further in the future and investigate that question. Unfortunately, the answer is there's inconsistent findings.
Thanks. Are there any questions? Oh, yeah. I'll bring the microphone to you.
Wonderful talk, Madeline. I'm wondering if you've ever looked at the amygdala with regard to this cohort. The reason I'm asking is that we're seeing in non-human primates who are exposed daily to THC gliosis.
Wow. So we did whole brain analyses. I put a citation to the preprint, and I'm happy to share it with you. We did whole brain analyses. I did not report them here, but we looked at, the amygdala as one of the brain regions, and we are seeing lower volume. But interestingly, when we control for persistent alcohol and tobacco use, those effects are no longer significant, suggesting, I think, that the story is about polysubstance use. And it also could be just very hard to disentangle cannabis from tobacco and alcohol. So we are seeing lower volume. It's just no longer there after controlling for use of other substances. Yes, so Ahmad Ariri is the PI of the neuroimaging in the Dunedin cohort, and I believe he's done both fMRI as well as MRI, but I don't know that they've done diffusion tensor imaging. Is that what you asked? Okay, partly because in New Zealand, I don't think they had that on the island, so I don't think so.
Is this on? Yeah, okay. Carsten Hjorthøj from the Copenhagen Research Center for Mental Health. So I think that was fascinating. I loved this update because I'm a big fan of your first study.
Thank you.
I was wondering, do you have data on mental health and mental well-being, or even above the threshold for common mental disorders such as depression and anxiety? And if you have investigated it or if you have plans to do so?
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. Yes, there are data on basically all mental health disorders, so depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, but also some that really haven't been investigated so much, like ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And I did take a peek at the data before coming here, and I can tell you that, like other studies, meta-analyses, the long-term cannabis users show higher risk of depression even after we take into account multiple other alternative explanations. They have higher risk of schizophrenia, which has been shown in the cohort before, but we're still seeing at age 45. They don't have higher risk of anxiety disorders. They don't have higher risk of ADHD. But those data are not published, and that was a quick peek.
Any other questions?
Questions? Okay. Thank you.